You recently wrote this article. It's an exclusive investigation that you published on your Substack, the title of which is Democrats' Dark Money Fund for TikTok Influencers' Social Media Craze. And there people can see it on the screen. And I want to ask you to sort of talk about your findings. But the thing I found so funny about this article is that when Kamala Harris began running, and we were so gaslit first about Biden, like, oh, if you say Biden's not mentally fit, it means you're spreading disinformation. And then suddenly they were like, oh my God, we see he's mentally unfit after the debate. And they had to get rid of him. And then they put Kamala in. And, she was considered a joke for 4 years. And then it suddenly became, she's exciting the whole country. She's like a generational political talent. And a lot of it was done based on this social media excitement that they were pointing to. I'm sure some of which was organic, but a lot of which obviously was not. And what is it that you found in this article that suggests at least a good portion of it wasn't?
Yeah, so, there's been a little bit of reporting over the years that the various campaign committees or candidates will fund, an influencer on TikTok or Instagram, and it's, $100,000 disclosed here and there. There's a little bit of reporting on it last year that the DNC had given small amounts to influencers. Well, that was really just the tip of the iceberg. I obtained documents from a group of Democratic donors, billionaires, folks like George Soros and others, who had put money into this dark money effort, was not disclosed during the election. It was through this 501c4 LLC kind of arrangement that, doesn't have to report any of its disbursements or its contributions. And it had this parallel effort to the Kamala campaign to basically orchestrate enthusiasm for this candidate. So, a lot of those Brat, Charlie XCX memes of people dancing and doing sketches and comedy shows, they even funded black voter-oriented YouTube talk show. There was just a number of sketches and YouTube influencers. Actually, the entire effort reached about 500 different creators across various platforms, where they were coaching creators, directly financing them, creating this kind of shadow effort to sell Kamala Harris to voters. And that was a very tough sell. This was not a candidate that had organic appeal to Gen Z or to young voters. In fact, if you look at the polls, she had really quite the opposite. But it attempted to manufacture support for this candidate. And for a brief moment last summer, it seemed to be working. But at the end of the day, the wheels really came off, because if anything, the targeted demographics, young people, black voters, Latino voters, they actually departed the Democratic Party in historic numbers.
I want to just ask you, and maybe this is kind of like a ambiguous observation, maybe it's even a little subjective, but when I was reading your article and even some of the examples you gave about some of the content that was produced by secret payments, it was as always just so cringy. It was just so embarrassing. It always seems like Democrats have no capability to speak in any kind of an authentic voice. Like when they try and do content for TikTok or content for the kids, it always just seems so contrived and just you want to kind of run in the opposite direction. And you can see now, and it's so obvious, that these Democrats are being told, oh, look, one of the reasons people like Trump is because he speaks the way people speak at home. He curses a lot. And now you see a lot of them cursing, whereas they never did before, just overnight. They're like, that's bullshit when they go on cable or whatever. It's so obvious they've been programmed that way. And, I'm not saying everything the Republicans do along those lines is going to connect or is super organic or natural, but you cannot deny that one of Trump's real political talents is speaking to ordinary people in a way that they just are convinced seems like the way they think and talk about things. That has all, I remember, as a matter of fact, maybe it was the 90s when I was living in New York, and I remember this, I don't know why I remember this, but Trump had visited a construction site, and he was talking afterward about how when he goes to this construction site, he spends an hour talking to the construction workers, and how the minute he gets there, they start screaming his name, and he was like, that's real fame. Anyone can be famous among the elite, but real fame is when construction workers call you your name. And he kind of was priding himself on that. I think I remembered it because it's a little pathetic to be like, I'm really famous, as it kind of comes from insecurity. But that is, that's why he was a successful TV star too. Like, he has that ability to connect with ordinary people, the way they speak, his humor, all of that. And Democrats just don't. Like, why do you think that is?
Well, part of it is that the Democrats retreated from presenting an authentic Kamala. Like, I think Kamala actually does have an interesting life story. Even though she's this kind of creature of the establishment, she's someone who's biracial, who grew up in a very segregated part of Berkeley, and who went to a Hindu temple most of her life, and had lots of interesting kind of relationships coming up in the San Francisco political machine. But she didn't talk about any of it, right? Like, she always presented this version of herself that I think polled well, or at least what seemed to kind of fit the mold of what voters are expected to support. So she just talked about her experience in the church as a Christian. She only kind of talked about herself as a Black woman, rather than someone who had a very mixed race experience. She even lied about her Berkeley upbringing. She kept saying she's from Oakland, because that seems to have a little bit more authenticity rather than triggering people and discussing her roots actually in Berkeley. And in contrast to that, you had Donald Trump going on Theo Vaughn's podcast and talking for an hour about his brother's suicide and being very real and authentic. And I think voters, especially when they're looking at these more long form platforms, looking at on YouTube or on podcasts or even on other forms of social media, they're looking to connect with politicians as real human beings. And Kamala Harris could never really present herself as a true human being. So that's where this kind of the documents I dug up came in. Like, they were kind of obsessed with pouring this $10 million fund into getting people to do little dances and sketches to try to humanize her, or to try to humanize her appeal. You can't manufacture that. You just have to be real with voters and kind of show all your scars and warts and not be ashamed of them. And this constant attempt to refashion Kamala as this super progressive, almost like civil rights, Black Power icon, plus she's a cop, plus she's part of the Biden legacy. It felt very contrived, because it was.
Yeah, I mean, I always thought, I always had the impression once Kamala Harris became vice president, where she was expected to be responsible for a whole variety of issues I don't think she knew anything about, because she just never had to deal with them before. She wasn't an expert in them. She spent her whole career as a prosecutor, basically, attorney general, prosecutor, and then when she got to the Senate, her moments where she kind of had good moments, where she sort of shined, were about the law. She was like very aggressive questioning Brett Kavanaugh. She, kind of interrogated in a very kind of effective courtroom manner other Trump nominees in the first term, but she really didn't know anything about international relations or anything else. And I always got the impression that when she was speaking, she was petrified of saying a wrong word that could be construed as like a mistake. And she just seems so imprisoned. And this is, this is what I'm finding kind of confounding is, for a long time, that was the role of politics, right? Like, it would be a scandal if you say the wrong thing, if you speak out of line, if you make a mistake, whatever. And then Trump came along and just blew all that away. I remember in 2015, that was when Trump spoke pejoratively about John McCain, who the press worshipped and loved and considered to be a saint. And he didn't just speak negatively about him. He said something kind of shocking, like people just didn't say, which is, he was captured as a war criminal, but I prefer the good pilots and people in the military who don't get captured. I prefer that. I think that's more impressive. And I remember all these journalists, including like Dan Bald, sort of like the dean of the Washington Press Corps, wrote articles saying, oh, this is the end of Trump. There's no way you could survive something like this. And he just blew right past it, blew past every single, didn't matter what he said, how he said it, whether he was wrong, whether he made errors. Like, he was speaking so authentically that it changed the way people started expecting politics. Probably the internet changed that as well, so that now people aren't listening to like Lester Holt in a suit speaking in like an uber formal way. They're listening to people who have more authentic voices. They expect that authenticity. And it's taken the Democrats so long to realize they're not in that world anymore. And it's almost like the whole party is programmed with these obsolete rules that they just can't get them. It just feels like there's no core there. There's no like character. Even now, like when they're cursing and like trying to be more rambunctious or whatever, it just seems so consultant scripted. Like there's no vibrancy to it. I mean, do you think like this is inherent in the Democratic Party, or is this something that they can kind of finally break out of?
It's hard to say. I feel that part of the problem for the Democrats is that for whatever reason, and it's a complex problem of both special interest group politics and the kind of pathologies of modern liberalism, perhaps, and kind of the class makeup of the party. But for whatever reason, the Democrats tend to have non-competitive primaries. Democrats kind of fall in line, their voters and their interest groups and the kind of their leadership behind the kind of pre-chosen candidates that are part of the party echelon, the leadership. And you just don't see that in the last 20 years of the Republican Party. After the George Bush years, you had these really kind of chaotic Tea Party primaries where dozens and dozens of Republicans on the national and state level were, the Republican establishment was challenged and unseated, and you had this kind of upheaval of voters. And yes, there were, interest groups involved there, but at least these were competitive primaries with a lot of fierce combat between candidates. And that changed the makeup of Congress, and it kind of laid the groundwork for a upheaval by Donald Trump for him to take on the Republican establishment and really kind of take his message to voters. And just like the market, the kind of consumer marketplace, the business marketplace, the best products and businesses tend to rise because you have that competitive atmosphere. That's a helpful dynamic in democracy as well. If we're going to have this kind of winner-take-all two-party system, which is a really terrible system, but if we're going to have the system, the way that Democrats can compete with Republicans is to open things up and allow more competition and encourage their voters and kind of the powers that be to allow open primaries and real competition. As long as you have these kind of pre-chosen candidates and this lack of competition, you have candidates who are not prepared to make the case to a general election. And for Kamala Harris, she was really a creature of the machine. She was very close to the Gettys and the kind of power brokers in San Francisco, and they kind of chose her to run against an unpopular district attorney, and they kind of shoot her in. And she was again kind of chosen by the powers that be in the California Democratic Party to rise up through the ranks. That's not a very healthy atmosphere for grooming and finding the best candidates to run for president, because it is a very difficult job, and finding candidates who can connect with voters in a visceral way. That doesn't happen from folks who are just chosen from a back room by party elders.
If your dog is constantly itching, scratching, or dealing with hot spots, you've got to check out Coat Defense. It's an all-natural solution that's been helping so many dogs, and here's why it caught my attention. I've seen firsthand. As you might know, I have 25 dogs at home. I have a shelter with about another 150. And when I work with the dogs at the shelter and even my own dogs at home, it's so often the case that they develop yeast infections, especially in their paws and ears and skin folds. It's really more common than a lot of dog owners realize. And oftentimes the usual treatments like steroids or antibiotics or Cytopoint or Apoquel, they might cover the symptoms up for a while, but they don't actually fix the root cause. And in some cases, they actually make things worse over time. Coat Defense is different. Their Daily Preventative Powder works as a dry shampoo, odor eliminator, and anti-itch powder. But what makes it special is that it eliminates yeast naturally by changing the terrain on your dog's skin so that yeast and bacteria can't survive. There's no toxic chemicals, no synthetic junk, just safe, natural ingredients. They also make an aloe-based sensitive skin shampoo that calms irritated skin, preserves the natural oils and microbiome, and is totally free of parabens, sulfates, and anything artificial. And honestly, I've been really surprised reading the testimonials of people. People are very guarded and very careful about their dogs. They tend not to be positive about a product. They're very cautious about it. And the testimonials have been really positive, and I've seen firsthand that it can work. I've heard from so many people that it's the only thing that's worked after years of frustration with dogs finally itch-free and healthy again, and that's why I'm happy to partner with Coat Defense. So if your dog has been struggling and nothing else has helped, go to coatdefense.com and use code Glenn for 15% off your first order. That's coatdefense.com, code Glenn. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.